Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us and giving us an hour of your time. Gracias a todos por acompañarnos esta tarde y brindarnos una hora de su tiempo. My name is Jesus Guzman. I'm the Policy and Advocacy Director for Generation Housing. Mi nombre es Jesús Guzmán y soy el Director de Política y Abogacía aquí con Generation Housing. First, just a few housekeeping notes for this evening's webinar on interpretation. This event is being simultaneously translated into Spanish. Este evento está siendo transmitido en vivo en español. To access that feature, click on the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen and select Spanish. Para acceder a este servicio, favor de oprimir el botón al fondo de su pantalla y seleccionar el botón para español. We want to thank Gabriel Gutierrez, who is providing our audience live Spanish interpretation this evening. Le queremos dar las gracias a Gabriel Gutierrez, quien nos brinda la interpretación al español esta tarde. Gabriel, thank you. Just one last note on participation for this evening's webinar. We invite the audience to submit a question. There will be a chance a little bit later in the program to submit a question, and we ask that you do so using the Q&A function that you can also find at the bottom of your screen. And we encourage you to add a question or vote by liking others' questions so that we can make sure that we get to the ones with the most interest from all of you. So I want to cover the agenda just so that we all know what to expect this evening. Again, we're really excited to bring all of you this evening's discussion. This webinar is intended for a general audience, though undoubtedly folks who work in housing are likely the most interested in tonight's topic. So we're really excited to have all of you here with us today. I'll start the agenda just by, we'll start the program by sharing a bit about our organization, Generation Housing. I'll then get a chance to introduce Conor Doherty, our author for the evening. And then I'll offer a few introductory remarks about his new book, Golden Gates, Fighting for Housing in America. And then we'll spend really most of our time in discussion, and we'll make sure to leave 15 minutes at the end for audience Q&A. And again, using that Q&A function that you can find at the bottom of your screen. Feel free as the discussion goes on to add those questions in there. We'll try to answer some of those questions as we go through the program. And if not, we'll make sure we get to as many of those at the audience Q&A portion of the agenda. It's 6:04, and we'll try to make sure we get everyone out of here by 7 o'clock. And again, really appreciate everyone being with us this evening. So I want to turn over to Jen Close, our Executive Director, who will share a few words about Generation Housing.
Thanks, Jesus. I just want to take a minute to briefly introduce our organization for those of you who might be joining us for the first time. Generation Housing, or Gen H, as we like to call it, is a new independent nonprofit organization created to advocate for more homes and more affordable homes in Sonoma County. Gen H advocates for housing not just for its own sake, but because we know that ensuring safe, stable, and affordable housing for all is the strongest lever that we can pull to improve individual economic opportunity and health and educational outcomes and our environment. Now I want to introduce Jesus, who's going to lead us for the rest of the show today. In conversation with Conor Doherty is Jesus Guzman, Gen H's Policy and Advocacy Director. Educated at Sonoma State and the UC Berkeley Goldman School of Public Policy, Jesus aligns his experience and training as a community organizer and policy analyst with a commitment to growing and fostering inclusive and equitable communities. Housing policy has been influential in Jesus's life, having been raised in farm worker housing and experienced firsthand the consequences of the Great Recession. Jesus is committed to ensuring that Sonoma County remains as welcoming to future generations as it has been to him and his family. Jesus.
Thank you, Jen. I'm delighted to introduce to the audience this evening's guest. Conor Doherty is an economics reporter at the New York Times. His work focuses on the West Coast, real estate, and wage stagnation among U.S. workers. Conor has covered economics and real estate on and off for a decade at both the Times and the Wall Street Journal. Before he worked at the San Diego Union Tribune and the Los Angeles Business Journal. He currently lives in Oakland, California, and he's a Bay Area native, having grown up in Noe Valley in San Francisco, where his parents still live today. I want to lift up a few stories from his reporting work on housing to, I think, help illuminate the breadth of experience that he brings to this work. In 2016, Conor published an article in the Times entitled "In Cramped and Costly Bay Area, Cries to Build, Baby Build." In 2017, Conor wrote a piece for the Times entitled "The Great American Single Family Home Problem" that profiled a fight in Berkeley over one lot density and one man's tomato garden. Admittedly, a story that probably brought both tears, frustration, and chuckles to those of us who read it at the time, and a piece that I still remember vividly today, 3 years later. And then last year, Conor published a story about Sheila Jones, a woman who wakes up at 2:15 a.m., takes 2 trains and a bus to get to her job by 7 a.m. And it's really a glimpse into what so many workers have to deal with every day as the imbalance between jobs and homes continues to grow. And of course, Conor's written and writes constantly and publishes stories about a variety of topics, which you can find at the Times, but wanted to lift those up because I think they're good examples of the work that and experience he brings to the topic, and really what we find in his book, Golden Gates, Fighting for Housing in America, which is the reason why we're here today, to hear from Conor and hear about the book. So I want to offer just a few remarks about the book itself before we jump into the discussion. Again, the book is entitled Golden Gates, Fighting for Housing in America. Conor chronicles America's housing crisis from its West Coast epicenter, peeling back the decades of history and economic forces that brought us here, and takes readers inside activist uprisings that have risen in tandem with housing costs. To tell this story about housing, Conor follows a struggling math teacher who builds a political movement dedicated to ending single-family housing neighborhoods, a teenage girl who leads her apartment complex against their rent-raising landlords, a nun who tries to outmaneuver private equity investors by amassing a multi-million-dollar portfolio of affordable homes. That's right, you heard that correctly. That's Sister Christina, I believe. And a suburban bureaucrat who roguishly embraces density in response to the threat of climate change. And you'll find a lot of different stories like that in the book related to housing. But it's indeed a character-driven book, and Golden Gates captures, I think, a vast political realignment during a moment of rapid technological and social change. And we'll get into all of those things here in just a moment. Want to share just a couple of reviews of the book from Matthew Desmond, who is a Princeton sociologist and author of the book Evicted. He writes in his review about Golden Gates, how do we solve a problem like California with its 3-hour commutes and sky-high rents? Well, deeply reported and fast-paced, Golden Gates introduces you to the people fighting for and against affordable housing in one of the world's hottest real estate markets. And following the clashes between political leaders, tenant activists, developers, and working families, Doherty brings a novel perspective to one of the nation's most urgent problems. So with that, again, many other reviews that really lift up the incisive portrayal into the lives of people that are trapped in a system with few good options, housing options, and something very salient to our current times. I want to welcome Conor. Conor, thank you so much for being with us this evening. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
So, Conor, to start our discussion, I think I want to ask you about what the book says about our present moment in housing. You start the book by spotlighting Sonia Traus, a math teacher struggling to make ends meet in the Bay Area. And she's going to planning commission meetings and speaking in favor of housing, all sorts of housing. What is it about Sonia that makes her a contemporary character? What is it about her that sort of reflects something that's happening in our times?
So thank you again for having me. Thank you, everyone. In addition to going to elementary school in San Francisco, I went to high school in Napa Valley, even though my parents still live in Noe Valley. So I'm very familiar with Sonoma, and I've spent a lot of time there. anyway, and I grew up in the Carneros area, so right, kind of really more on the Sonoma border than Napa. But anyway, so you know, whenever I'm doing stuff, and especially whenever I'm doing a story, and especially a story as challenging as housing policy, you know, which is this fundamental important thing that, as you guys pointed out, touches when Jen was talking about your guys' mission statement, housing is the center of, you know, economic mobility, you know, integration, whatever, all the like timeless issues and the most pressing issues. Housing sits at the center of all of them, because really it sits at this idea of how do we make a place together? How do we make a city together? I mean, that's never been easy and is never going to be easy, but working on it is like the stuff of human beings, you know? And so it's really important. But when you get to the policy stuff and how zoning works and things like that, it can sound really boring. And so when I went into this, first as a reporting topic, but then ultimately a book, I was always asking the question, you know, how do I make this interesting? And what I came to was, I felt like what was missing was this question of why has so little changed? It seemed like 40 years ago, California, there was there was books written, there was articles written, there were articles written, there was laws passed about how California had this really bad housing problem. It wasn't as bad as today, but it was bad, and it was still the worst in the nation. And so I thought, well, you know, finding a prescription seems not important. You know, I'll go through the prescriptions in the book, but that seemed not that important to me. The question, what is it that's making this so difficult to change? That seemed like the more important question. And so I asked, well, who's trying to change it? And just follow them and see why it's so hard. See them beating their head against the wall, if you will. So this all led me to this question, why is it that people who potentially might live in a house that is, or an apartment or an affordable housing complex that isn't yet built, why are those people, you know, not part of the process? And the obvious answer is they don't know who they are, and it's just a hard, abstract concept. I mean, just think about it. I'm going to show up to the city council to complain about some theoretical thing that isn't built yet because I might theoretically live in it someday, right? I mean, it's just like a brain teaser. And I came across Sonia one day through somebody I had met introduced me to Sonia, and she was trying to do this. She was trying to create a movement of people who were angry about homes that didn't exist yet because they might live in them someday, in their own community and sometimes in other cities. And it just sounded like a bizarre exercise. And also she's a kind of a bombastic character. The first time we met, she showed up in a cop car, an orange Crown. It was a Crown Victoria, one of those old police cars, and it was painted orange and it had glitter in it. And she walks into the meeting in a fluorescent outfit with like a sweatshirt for like a 80s heavy metal band on. And I just thought it was, and then she talked so harshly. She called people bad names and stuff. And this, of course, eventually got her in trouble. But she was really screaming about this problem and screaming about it from a perspective I had never heard. You know, the person who is unhappy that something they might have lived in didn't get built. So that was probably, so I think Sonia really was a kind of, I guess I began it with Sonia because one, she's, you know, I have to admit, she's just like this explosive character, and starting off the book that way felt important. But also, I think she was a great vehicle into this just, you know, tough, can be wonky stuff. But when you saw things through her personal experience, For instance, she lived across the street from an apartment complex that had become a crack house growing up, and her dad helped turn it into it's market rate housing, but it's pretty affordable for Philadelphia. I mean, it's a cheaper city. And so she, you could see how she was very intellectually aware that housing, and it had been this like luxury complex just a couple decades before that. So you could tell the story of how housing changes identities over time. Sometimes it's luxury housing, then years later it's affordable housing, and how does that work? But talking about that in an economics paper kind of way is sort of boring, but if you just see it through the life of this really regal apartment complex that eventually becomes this really troubled apartment complex, and then ultimately finds itself somewhere in the middle, I thought that was it. And then the other thing is, I will say, when I met Sonia, the first time I met Sonia for probably, I'd known her for a while, but I flew to Philadelphia one time just for 2 days when I was towards the end of the book. And it was sort of, because I didn't want to do it till the end, just from a timing standpoint. But my God, I went to her house and walked around her neighborhood and even went to her childhood room, and it just all made perfect sense to me. So, because one of the things that she kind of runs up against over and over again in the book is people saying, oh, I'm worried about neighborhood character. How could you build it would be out of place to build a more dense apartment complex anywhere near a single family home. And her answer was always, why would that be out of place? What's wrong with that? And I go to her house, and her parents live in one of these pretty large old Philadelphia home with 3 stories and a decent sized yard. But then I go to her childhood bedroom window, and you look out the window, and there's a giant apartment complex like right outside the window on the other side of their yard. And then if you kind of go in the window and look that way across the street, there's a public housing complex for seniors that's probably 10 stories high. The one right across is about 5. Then I walk through her neighborhood, and there's all sorts of different stuff. There's like a pretty big school next to like a convalescent home that has like a pretty substantial parking lot, but then you just go a little bit beyond that and you're into this very old historic district where they have like this old building where George Washington lived for a brief period, which is of course the sort of like super colonial stuff is all over Philadelphia. Anyway, and so when you get into these questions, what looks out of place, how zoning works, how does housing change identities over many years, and then of course, just the bombast of activism and all this. She just was a great character for us to see housing, and really to some extent the history of housing, through this one person's kind of experience and activism. So I guess, like I said, in the end, I was just trying to be one thing, which was not boring, and finding characters that could take us on that journey and help us learn things, but without feeling like we had to work hard to learn them. I thought she was a perfect vehicle for that, and so I wanted to kind of do that. I wanted to open with that sense of things, and just to set the tone that this could be a fun book. That even though it was about this difficult subject and sometimes a wonky subject, that it could still be very fun to read.
Yeah, I saw that Ed Glazer offered a review of the book, and I read a number of his papers before. I was not expecting to have Ed Glazer introduced into this book the way that you did with Sonia and all the other characters. So I know that early on in the book, you have a line that I think speaks to one of the things you were mentioning earlier about Sonia, which was the line says, how do you stoke the outrage of people who don't live somewhere yet? And I think that's very much the challenge of a lot of organizations like ours and others that are advocating for more housing, and that's a pretty distinct challenge. I want to ask you, Conor, about. It seems like the book, at least my interpretation of it, is that it's a book less about housing and more about people's failures to relate to each other. There's a lot of, clearly housing is the context, the central sort of policy question, but housing is an issue fraught with really messy politics. housing policy and the policy playbook really has been around for a long time. Like it's not as if we're coming up with a whole lot of new ideas for how to address housing. We're sort of tweaking things around the edge often, but it's the politics that are really messy. So I'm wondering, how do the characters in the book sort of speak to that inability to relate to each other, and why does it feel like it's such an intractable problem?
So thank you. Thank you for saying that. I think maybe I realized that this book was about people failing to relate to each other like halfway through it. You know, meaning that there were times when I thought, oh, well, is it this set of policy solutions? Is it this set of policy? You know, meaning that if they changed up what they were arguing about, or the terms of the argument changed, or they reached some sort of negotiation, that they could overcome that. But at some point I just realized, no, these characters are going to keep fighting with each other almost no matter what. And that, I mean, maybe not forever, hopefully, but that their failure housing was their expression of their failure to relate to each other, as you said. I think at just some point you just realize it's not about, it's like anything, right? You know, if you see people argue long enough, you realize, and talk past each other, that you realize, well, it's not really about whatever they're talking about anymore. It's about something else. And there was, again, towards the end of the book, I encountered this sociologist who kind of talked about how housing and these kind of invisible lines, these sometimes visible, sometimes invisible lines, the kind of proverbial other sides of the tracks, that they become ways in which we categorize people who are different from us in some way. And in America, this context is obviously race frequently, pretty much predominantly, but you see the same thing in lots of other places. Maybe probably the best example is over different kinds of divisions, be they religious or whatever. But I mean, if you've ever, I went to Northern Ireland in the late 80s when I was a kid, and people hate each other, but they look exactly the same, you know, and their religion is slightly different, but it's not so different that it's right. So this is something we deal with throughout every culture, throughout time, sometimes violently, sometimes just with politics, hopefully, right? And where and how people live often becomes our interpretation of that. And this is not always, and this is true both ways, right? And so what I guess as I started to kind of process through this, I just kind of realized, you know, people are coming together in cities, gentrification being the one version of that, but they're being pressed together in ways that hasn't really happened for a while, because suburbanization had been kind of the predominant mode for so many decades. And that them coming together, it was actually, you know, at the beginning, people talk about things like urbanism and biking and, you know, all these things that might be nice about living in a more dense area, but then they realize there's other people there, they've been there a long time, they're not so happy about things changing. And housing is just the vehicle for them to argue over this. And anyway, so that, I guess I would just, to answer your question, I felt like the more I just saw how intractable the arguments were, the more I kind of started leaving the realm of economics and housing policy and going and talking to sociologists and other people who study like how people relate to each other, because I just realized it can't really just be about this. It has to be about something else. And just to follow up on that, like ultimately when we start talking about solutions, I feel that those kind of people relating to each other, like you said, solutions, I can't just name any off the top of my head, but that will turn out to have been more important than policy, say. You know, people I don't know what it is, but maybe they could eventually share it. It used to be that things like churches, public schools, like shared institutions was our way to get to know our neighbors in ways that helped us bridge disagreements we might have in other areas, because we would just naturally, you're more willing to question your assumptions when someone you trust is the one pushing you to question your assumptions.
Mhm.
But if it's someone you immediately don't trust, they have their position, you have yours, and it just goes tribal, right? So anyway, yeah, I think that at some point you just have to realize after so much arguing, you realize people just it can't really be about what they're arguing about anymore.
Yeah. There's a lot of assumptions that I think that your book dispels around housing. What are some of the most common kind of misconceptions or myths that you, through this book, sort of help dispel in how we think about housing?
So I appreciate you saying that, and I will talk about them in a second. But the one thing I want to say before I get there is, while I thought it was important to dispel things and go through what do data and other things and stories, and investigation, what do they tell us, right? But ultimately, I'm not sure, for all the reasons we just said in the previous question, that matters all that much. Because if you go, for instance, it seems that new development does not increase gentrification pretty much at all. And it certainly doesn't seem like it does it at anywhere near the scale people think it does, right? But if you go and you tell someone who's worried about gentrification that, and you show them a bunch of charts, it's not going to do anything, because they are dealing with a pretty existential fear of losing their home, and that's a powerful force. And so if you want to sort of figure out how to make common cause with that person, a bunch of charts and data is not going to really do it, right? So I do think, so that's an example of one. I think the fact that there's really just the fact of a housing shortage. It seems like it's only recently that people have really started to internalize that. I think also one thing I think is a common misconception that I actually thought was the most, the one I don't want to say most proud of, but the one that I felt like it enhanced my own understanding, is that, so there's a whole chapter in the book where there's this girl, 15-year-old girl, Stephanie Gutierrez, and she comes home one day and finds an $800 rent increase taped to her door. It's like this devastating thing. Her mother is cleans houses and then also does like elder care, and there's no way they can pay that. So she becomes kind of a organizer on the fly, organizes a huge protest of this landlord, really is like leading all these adult tenants against this landlord. So mild spoiler, they still lose the apartment. And they do get a buyout deal, which is a very common way these kinds of fights are, worked out. And then I go and met the other family. So they move out, and then I went back just a couple days later and met the new family. So the new family, turns out, had been living in East Palo Alto in an even more crowded house. And there was I think there was 7 or 8 of them in that family, and they had similar descriptions. They were the Pineda family, and they, I think the 3 sons did construction. And I think the mom did some kind of house cleaning too. So there's a very similar profile, but they just put more people into the same place, and so could then cover the rent. This is really common. It's not like I discovered that, but there's this, we always think of gentrification as like people move in and other people move out, but it actually doesn't often work like that. What happens is people move in and then other people move in closer together in the same place. That the actual, particularly at the beginning, displacement is actually not as bad as we think it is. The displacement from their place is bad, but the displacement from the area isn't. But it leads to this really safe overcrowding, right? Which is horrible. I'm not saying displacement isn't bad. I'm saying like that it leads to this thing that we don't talk about. We don't talk enough about the overcrowding aspect of this, right? And that is something that is even more important now with this COVID-19, because our de facto affordable housing system, because we don't have enough affordable housing, is to just tell people to, you know, crowd together. So I think that trying to sort of follow, where do people go? What happens after they leave? Who moves in? And throughout the protest that Stephanie was leading, people thought, like, people kept saying, oh, Facebook people are going to move in, you know, it'll be tech engineers. And it wasn't who it was at all. And I went through that whole building and then the other building that had organized together with them, and it was the same situation. You could see it. Well, first off, I met a number of the other people. The trash cans were overflowing. You could just tell that tons of people had moved in there. And anyway, so I, you know, I guess I thought that following people's stories and asking where do people go, what happens, that some of those myths about how gentrification really happens and what it really looks like might be dispelled. And it's not to say it's a more positive story. It's actually more negative, but it's just different, right? People think, oh, everyone moves in, higher income people move in and the other people move to Tracy, you know, which is in the, you know, out in Stockton area. And yeah, some of that happens, but the more common thing seems to be that people move together in the same space, and you know, meaning in the same neighborhood. And asking why and how that happens seemed important to me. You know, because you find out that people have neighborhoods. I mean, it's not surprising, right? People have neighborhoods and communities. So I guess those are some of the myths. I don't know.
Yeah, Connor, I want to add, because there's that one caught my attention. It's in that chapter of no hay peor lucha que la que no se hace.
Yes.
And
say that during the reading of the audiobook. I had to
right. We'll follow up. There's a line, right? Because you talk about, it says that given the choice between leaving the state, moving to Tracy, or piling together, most people choose to pile in, and you cite this UC Berkeley study of looking at displaced families in San Mateo County. And it was about 40% of displaced tenants stayed within 4 miles of their old place. You know, illustrating very much kind of what you're describing there. I mean, I've had so much of my own family that grew up in Fremont and Newark, that moved to Modesto, Turlock, and Patterson, and many of them who live together in the same, in just smaller places, that have stayed here in the Bay Area, because that's where a lot of the jobs are. Either folks are commuting in from Stockton, like some of my family, or others who have just, roomed together and just try to make things work. And that's largely a function of low wages, high housing costs, and all the above. So I think that passage very much resonated for me when you were describing the displacement of folks in, I think, what was it, Fair Oaks, Little Michoacan?
Yes, North Fair Oaks, which has a fascinating history, that neighborhood. And I was fortunate that this one, he's now a professor, but this guy, when he was a graduate student in the 80s, did this basically wrote a book. It was a PhD thesis, but, about this neighborhood. And he went down to Michoacan, to, Aguililla,
Mm-hmm.
and he went and met like the first people who ever came to North Fair Oaks from there. And he was able to track this whole migration. So there was this fascinating history of the neighborhood that was also the history of Mexico, or that part, as well. And this is, I mean, everybody knows this, but this is extremely common, almost not even just common. It's like the way migration almost always works. is that when you find people in a place like Little, in North Fair Oaks, almost they don't just come from the same. A lot of them don't just come from the same country. They came from like the same town, or even like the same neighborhood of the same town. And this is true. The African American migration to the north, through from World War I to 1970. The same thing happened, where there would be like certain little towns in Florida and Alabama and Louisiana and wherever, and you would find neighborhoods, pockets of those people from the exact same little town, like in Los Angeles or Chicago or whatever. So it was, anyway, separate story, but the story of Little Michoacan, which I only touched a little bit of in the book, I thought was fascinating. And that was one of the fun things about the book, is if you just like ask enough questions and really start following these things, you find out the neighborhoods are really fascinating too. But one thing I should just add to that is, now just think about that for a moment. I mean, I don't have to tell you to think about it, but here's this really cohesive culture, a culture that bridges two countries. It's like a mix of, it's very specific to even a city in a country. Things as specific as like when they celebrate certain holidays, what dates, how they celebrate them, the stores that cater to them nearby on Middlefield Road. Takes a long time to develop a culture that rich. And it is a really unique culture. It's the only place in the world probably where that culture exists, because it's not really just Little Michoacan. It's not Aguililla and it's not Silicon Valley. It's some weird mix of those two things. And the people who live there and experience it are probably the only people in the world who that like specific mesh of things is their culture, right? And of course they don't want to leave that to go to Tracy or wherever. And so when they're faced with, are you going to be displaced or are you going to crowd in together, the pull of staying near this really important culture to them is obviously is in many cases going to overwhelm the more pleasantness of having a larger space. And so it's not surprising why people are so why they're so willing to endure such conditions to stay nearby friends, family, and community.
I want to pivot because some of the things we've been talking about are things that have been happening with the characters sort of in present time. You do quite a bit of sort of the genealogy of California housing policy, and you have quite a robust section around sort of a few different fights that happen in California, and one of them is in the Plan of Oppression chapter. You describe in this passage the way in which Americans up until the 1970s used to think about their homes, first and foremost as a place to live. And I don't think we can take for granted the fact that isn't necessarily shared across the board. And you describe the way that afterwards, a lot of folks came to view residential real estate as a really good financial investment. You compare it to the stock market. And I'm curious sort of what changed during that time period? What is it that shifted? And what is it how is it that change has ultimately impacted our current housing crisis? How do we trace some of that to our present day?
So this is a huge question, and one that I don't know that I've satisfactorily answered. I'll answer the question, but I just meant just as a landscape for this. One of the things that kept coming back to, so surprising to me, is how much mobility and opportunity, meaning the chance to get better off in the next generation, changed so much after the late 1970s. And there's been so many books, there's been a ton of other books written about this. There was just another book written about Wall Street traders. Any book that's been written about the fall of unions takes that late 70s period as one of its start dates. The kind of there's a show on television right now called Mrs. America that's really great, but it's about the women's movement, and it kind of profiles the growth of the really kind of hyper-conservative movement, and that starts in 1980. You know, the pay that a CEO made versus the lowest paid worker in the company, that's when that started growing like crazy. So something happened with the US economy at the end of the 1970s where it just broke. There are, you know, some political answers to this. There are some economic answers to this. There's a lot of different answers to this. But I bring that up only to say housing seems to be caught up in this same thing. Anyway, so I just think that's important, that when we're asking all these huge questions about how did the world become so unequal and how did it become so hard to get ahead, when we start looking back for where all these things went wrong, that ends up being the origin point for a lot of them. And exactly what it was, again, there's entire libraries full of books about what this was. In terms of housing specifically, in the 1970s, we had this bout of hyperinflation, where every single year, the cost of food, housing, college, whatever, went up 10, 12%. And people flipped out because that's a very destabilizing place to go. You don't even know how much your paycheck will be worth 2 weeks after you get it, right? And housing, for sort of wonky reasons, turned out to be a great investment during this period. And that's because, for starters, you usually buy a house your house payment is fixed, so it does not go up like food and medical care, or like food and electricity and all these things do. And on top of that, you're able to deduct your mortgage from your taxes, so your taxes go down, at least in the first few years. So this made people very protective of their homes because they saw it as their buffer against this financial force overwhelming their lives in other places, you know, in their paychecks. So I think on top of that, you know, white flight and all that type of stuff was really starting to reach its apex at that time. And people were starting to be very conscious of home prices as being a way to discriminate. I don't know that very many people would have internalized it that way, but it's hard to believe that wasn't part of it. So yeah, a lot of, and as you kind of said in the question, I went back and traced a bunch of old newspaper articles and books. And there's this really cool thing you can do with Google analysis to see like how often certain words are used. And home prices was just like never used before, at least not commonly. And then out of nowhere, it was like within a couple of years, and certainly by the end of the decade, people were always writing articles about home prices, and people were checking their home prices and thinking about their home prices. And by the way, I will say, just as an aside, when you go to the other parts of the United States where home housing isn't as huge of a deal, it's a huge deal everywhere, but the like where it's not the cost of housing so much as it's the wages, right? It's fascinating to me to read the newspapers in those places because they just never mention home prices. It's like just like not, people just like aren't like thinking about it. You know, it's just like not an article. Whereas here in our newspapers, it's just like there's always, oh, this month home prices went, you know, it's just like in the air all the time. So yeah, I think that's what happened. But without getting too deep off into another path, I actually do think this like what happened in the late 70s thing is this really, it's a question I'm consumed with. And I don't know the answer to it perfectly, other than it's everything. Anyway, by the way, I'll just, if I can just say one other thing, just because I usually say this at the end. but since we're talking about the 70s, I thought it would be a good time. When I finished this book, I went and read another book just because I wanted to, for the first time, read a book that would be like fun. Because I was like, oh, I'm finally done with this. I don't have to read housing books anymore. And I read this book about New York in the late 70s. And it was, their city was going broke, crime everywhere. They had a big blackout, and that led to a riot. And you're reading the book and you're thinking like, how, it's called Ladies and Gentlemen, the Bronx is Burning. And you're thinking, how can the city ever get out of this? It's going to go away. It's like they're falling into a black hole. And of course we now know that's like year zero. Wall Street's about to happen, just around the corner, Wall Street, it was about to go crazy. There will be all this excess, and it will ultimately lead to today, 40 years later, when they're, where they're going to have all these gentrification fights that we're having around the country. And really what I realized is the book isn't really about New York. It's about, kind of the like fall of American cities, but, and then now we know there's been this huge rise to where we have the housing crisis that you and I are talking about. And I think, in a way, my book is probably documenting year zero of whatever we're going to be 40 years from now. I don't know what that will be, but I do know that these problems of inequality and housing and lack of education, public budgets, all these things, I think we're at a point that we gotta, like, something is going to happen. Whether or not we'll solve it, I'm not sure. I just know that when we're 40 years from now and we ask who did we be, what kind of society did we become, we will see, it might be a really bad answer. I hope it's a good one. But I think we'll look back at this period, especially with coronavirus, which will mark year zero of so many things. And we'll say that was where, whatever we did become, we can see the seeds of that in that time. And again, like I said, I don't know what that is yet. I'm just confident that we are at the very beginning of it right now.
Conor, I want to ask you just one more question, and I know we've got a couple of questions in the audience Q&A. We want to encourage folks to add some questions there as well. We'll come to the audience Q&A in just a moment. But my last question that I did want to ask you, Conor, was just because I found Steve Fox such an interesting character, and that chapter itself was sort of a roller coaster where Dennis O'Brien finds himself paying for both. It was it was pretty. It's a really interesting chapter. Again, want to encourage everybody in the audience to we'll get to details on how to purchase the book, but again, just really want to reinforce that it's an excellent read, and want to make sure folks get a copy. This chapter with Steve, he's the city manager of the city of Lafayette in the East Bay. He's in the midst of this fight, and he comes to this realization. And you write, he says that it was hard to watch his kids struggle with rent and not start to think that maybe Sonia had a point. I guess I'm curious what, that line, that realization, it shifted things for Steve. What was your reaction when you're hearing Steve share that with you?
Well, both excitement and disappointment. This gets into, I'm half kidding, but this gets into like writer stuff. But, so I met Steve in late 2015. And at that time, he really was not happy with Sonia. And he liked her personally, but he was very unhappy with what she was doing. So Sonia, just to tell people who are watching, there's a development in the city of Lafayette, which is this exclusive suburb on the BART line in the East Bay. And somebody wanted to build a development there that had 315 apartments. And this activist Sonia comes, and then the city basically tells the developer, let's build 44 homes instead. And this activist Sonia comes along and sues the city, saying, you unfairly got rid of the affordable apartments, because some of the 315 would have been affordable to build single family homes. And of course, the best part about this is, which you just kind of alluded to, is this other group comes and sues from the other side, saying that the 44 homes is too big. So he's now stuck between two lawsuits, one saying it's too small and one saying it's too big. And over this time of the 4 years I got to know him, he just completely transformed into being very defensive against this project, as you pointed out, eventually going like totally rogue and advocating for policies that would take power away from Lafayette, like basically take power away from him, and then ultimately quits. Watching him change was great because, like, you know, as a writer, you go into these things just, you can't bank on what's going to happen. You know, if it's a novel, you can just make it up. But I distinctly remember we got lunch one day and he said to me, well, I'm going to resign. Don't tell anyone yet, but since you're writing a book and it's like, you don't have to worry about it for several months. And then he called me the day he did resign and said, hey, if you want to come down to he didn't actually tell me, he said, come down to the city meeting tonight, you might be interested. Now I knew he was going to resign, but that's how he said it to me. So, so I thought it was, you know, again, as a writer, I thought it was like, wow, this is gold. Like there's this very clear arc and he's going to have a very distinct end. He's going to quit his job. I never knew any of that going into the story. So that was just like, what a gift, right? But also, the reason I say disappointed, and I'm only half kidding, I kind of want to, you know, as the book tries to show a lot of different perspectives. It's the perspective of Stephanie Gutierrez, the perspective of someone like Sonia, who represents like a new arrival to California. And I really wanted to try to get like a more, well, what is it like to be trying to kind of steer a suburban community perspective? And then he, of course, goes completely rogue and basically adopts Sonia's position. So I was almost like missing that kind of, I was almost like missing the perspective that he had at the beginning because he just completely rejects it. But I thought, yeah, so I guess I want to tell you some weighty thoughts about housing policy or something, but I was just excited that I had this crazy twist in my book. Because when you're writing nonfiction, you don't get to make things up. So just him having a crazy twist was just, I was just excited that he had a crazy twist.
It was, that line stuck with me because it was the experience of so many of my peers that I went to school with. I grew up here in Sonoma Valley. Many of my high school classmates no longer live in the area. And so it was when he was saying it was hard to watch his kids struggle with rent and not be able to move back, that really stuck with me. Conor, I want to move to the audience Q&A. We've got a few minutes. I want to make sure I get a few of these questions in for folks that have contributed some questions. So I'm going to do two at a time here, and you can field them kind of as you may. And they're short questions. But the first one is, what private and/or public incentives could be put in place to foster more equitable housing outcomes? So that's the first question. The second one is asking about Minneapolis and the single-family zoning that happened there in terms of the banning of single-family zoning. So, and whether that experience is anomalous. So both of
those things are kind of interesting. So I was actually on a conference, a call like this with a group in Minneapolis last night. So, and my wife's from Minneapolis, so I spend a lot of time there actually. It's a lovely place. Speaking broadly, I guess the way I think of it as is the government has a startling amount of control over housing, right? I mean, it's much different than like Facebook or Google or something like that, where it's not like Google has to like ask the government if they want to introduce a new product. You know, they just, you know, whatever, it's YouTube for kids. It's actually that one they do have to ask the government, but you know, like special Gmail, like whatever, you know, they just do these things, right? And so that makes housing really unique in that the government does have a lot of control over it. And sometimes the control is really good and sometimes it's really bad. I think that one thing that I think what we should philosophically recognize is that regulation, though very appropriate and something we need in a civilized society, has a cost. And that cost is, you know, it's not, we should be mindful of the cost. It's not to say that the cost is always too much, but there is a cost there and we should just be aware of it all the time. Taking that cost and giving it back to the developer in exchange for something, like say more units or more affordable units, seems like a good, smart way to frame how your incentives would work. I'll give you an example. Scott Wiener passed a law called SB 35, which I kind of document in the book. And basically it gets all into this complicated stuff. But functionally, the way it shakes out is if you're proposing middle income or affordable housing, you basically don't even have to go to the city council. You know, that if there's a parcel that has been designated for affordable housing in your city and you propose affordable housing on that parcel, the city basically has to just let you do it. The city council can't even weigh in on it. There's an example in Cupertino where basically a developer was having so much trouble with the city, they redid the whole project to add a ton of affordable housing just to end around the city council through that law. So think about it for a moment. They basically calculated, okay, the regulatory cost of us getting this thing approved is going to be X million dollars. If we just make a whole bunch more affordable units, we can just end run that process and save Y million dollars, right? So in that way, they're using kind of the carrot of, oh, I'll let you out of this process as a way to basically not force the developer, but just nudge them towards that decision. So I think that recognizing, so philosophically, like I said, I think we should recognize, like, if we take something away, we can get something back for it. And that can, I think that should be how we think about those incentives. There's another project I looked at in the this is actually one of the things I was most excited about in the book, where a developer goes and buys land from Caltrans, right? And then goes to the city, they rezone it so that it can be taller. Then he goes in and proposes a third of the development will be affordable housing, but basically, and then 2/3 will be market rate, and the market rate is basically paying for the affordable housing. So just take a moment and think about that. There's a piece of empty land that our state owns at a time in which it's very worried about this housing crisis. A developer buys that land from that state. They go to the city, basically have a meeting, and suddenly there's like hundreds of millions of dollars just out of nowhere, you know, that has been dedicated to affordable housing in the form of, you know, basically he's going to use the market rate to pay for the affordable. So there's all sorts of incentives like that where we could just be mixing and recognizing the value in land that is untapped, but that's the public's value, that is. And then also the cost of regulation, and playing with those two things to get developers to build more affordable housing.
Conor, if you've got...
you know what? The Midwest, they just do things differently. They, no, I think something like Minneapolis will happen everywhere. In fact, by the way, Nancy Skinner last year passed a law that would allow triplexes pretty much through most of California. It's a little different than Minneapolis, but they basically passed a very similar law to Minneapolis in California. We will see if it shakes out quite that way. But that law was more or less passed in California last year. You would put an ADU there, and then you would split the house, but it still net ends with 3 units. So I actually think we'll see a lot of that in a lot of different places. You know, we'll see. But they don't have the initiative system and all this crazy stuff over there. So it is a little bit more rational how their politics works. And by the way, I should also note, I don't need to tell you guys this, but reminder that this is how we used to build cities. If you go to any older neighborhood in Minneapolis, which I've spent a ton of time in, or San Francisco, or any place, you will see a lot of like bigger apartment buildings, not huge, but decent size, mixed in with the city. Here is the best possible example of that. If you've ever seen the Painted Ladies in San Francisco, this iconic image of, I actually asked if this could be the cover of the book and they rejected it, but they're along this hill, and that was the opening of the show Full House. And what is always cropped out of the picture is that there's a 7-story apartment building on the corner that butts up against the topmost house. And I invite everybody here to Google Painted Ladies San Francisco. Go to Google Image. It'll take you a couple pages, but you'll see someone eventually takes a wider shot, and what that neighborhood actually looks like and how people have idealized it on a postcard is so different. So when we think about how do we build rational cities and how did we do this in the past, mixing and matching things in was how we always did it. And so maybe we'll be coming back to that, but it's not new. It's not revolutionary. It's something we just used to always do.
Conor, I want to get in 2 last quick rapid fire questions before we close up this evening, because we are at 7 o'clock. And again, really appreciate everybody being with us. And so we've got one on whether the solution to changing hearts and minds with respect to housing is changing the outlook on housing by the leaders of institutions like churches and schools. And then there's one on what it's going to take for communities to realize that housing is really undermining our local economy. And then if you have a second, there's a question about the neighborhood in Philadelphia that Sonia grew up in, and just which neighborhood that is. So
she's from Germantown. She went to Germantown Friends, which is a Quaker school. So she is from Germantown. On Schoolhouse Lane or something in Germantown, but near the I think it's called the Germantown White House or something, but it's a building where George Washington lived briefly. Okay, what was your other question? So the public institutions like schools.
And the other one was how to get communities to realize that housing is undermining local economies. Or the lack of housing.
Yeah, well, it's hard for people to see that because it's this regional economy. You know what I mean? Like it's Palo Alto's housing policy is almost certainly undermining the Bay Area economy, but it's hard for Palo Alto to see that it's undermining its economy. And it's extra hard for their city council people to have any incentive to vote that way, right? So this is kind of the problem of the book, right? I mean, this is what I think I did well in the book, but also what makes it hard, which is that you're trying to illustrate the invisible hand, as it were, right? It's very hard to, one of the hardest things in government, anybody in government will tell you, is to prove a negative, which is the things not done cost more than the things done. It's just hard to see. This is one reason why, another thing that annoys me, we have all these tax incentive programs we do for, if this company expands here, they'll get, some tax break. Sports stadiums often get this. There's so much evidence that none of that stuff works. But because the city just goes, tax program, and then the next week next year there's a stadium, people just think they work. So that's an example of the opposite, where people think something works and it doesn't work, right? So it's so hard to illustrate these things. I guess one way to do it is and it's extra hard in California where we have Prop 13, and so it's not immediately apparent what the tax incentives are. So I don't have a super good answer to that other than show people charts, tell people stories, explain. But as I kind of told you throughout this interview, like, I just don't find that the lecturing stuff works. I guess you could, community benefit agreements, which are, obviously that's an old tactic, but if a park or something like that comes with a particular development, people sometimes see that as a benefit. Explaining economics of it is really hard. So I don't have an easy answer other than the normal things and illustrating them in all the development processes. But whether or not people will absorb that, I'm less, you know, confident of. By the way, so Jim asks, SB 35 must go through a process. Yes, I mean, I'm aware of that, but I just meant if you choose to make your project an SB 35 project, you should be pretty streamlined if it qualifies. Because I mean, they just did this Cupertino thing, and it went through, and actually, in a somewhat, there were two SB 35 projects that were just sued, and they both just came out in favor of the developer who was trying to use it. So that should have actually firmed up the law even more, because it's now been tested a couple times. And those tests, you know, have the effect of strengthening it. So.
Well, Connor, thank you again so much for joining us this evening. Big thank you to you. And I want to just make sure that we get some information for folks about how to purchase the book. Want to make sure that we encourage everyone, again, to purchase a copy of the book. We recommend you patronize one of our local bookstores, which you can find by visiting IndieBound to find your nearest local bookstore here in Sonoma County. We've also reached out to Copperfield's Books, and they have several copies in store that they've ordered in anticipation of today's webinar. So if you haven't read the book, we encourage you to do that. It'll make a great gift as well. So make sure you get that out to your friends and family. That's something I've done, as well as getting copies to some friends of mine who are really into housing. So it makes for a really excellent gift. So check out IndieBound, check out Copperfield Books, and make sure you pick up a copy. Want to share just a few words about the webinar today, which is part of a series of events the Generation Housing is hosting in May. This has been really a whirlwind month of different webinars that we've done through Zoom because of the shelter in place, obviously. But if you want to check out any of the events that we've done this month, go to our YouTube channel, and we'll have a recording of tonight's discussion with Connor and the book up on our YouTube channel here within the next day or two. So again, we want to encourage you to go check that out if you want to share this with others. Also want to encourage folks to visit any and all of our social media channels to stay up to date on local housing. So again, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and of course, YouTube and our website, generationhousing.org. I want to thank all of you who have already joined Gen H as members since our launch. If you or your organization would like to join our efforts to increase the supply, diversity, and affordability of housing in Sonoma County, please visit our website to join Gen H. Connor, thank you again so much for joining us. Thanks to everyone who joined us for this conversation. We hope that this has been informative for everyone. And in the meantime, please stay safe and healthy. And we look forward to seeing all of you again soon. I hope everyone has a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Connor.